A millionaire accidentally helps twins on Christmas Eve. The next day, he unexpectedly finds them standing at his wife's grave. The house was too large for silence to fill completely, but it tried. The faint hum of the heater, the occasional creak of aging wood, and the crackle of flames in the hearth struggled to drown out the hollow void that echoed through the grand halls of the Livingston estate. Outside, the Phoenix skyline glittered under a cold winter night, but the world beyond his mansion walls might as well have been a different planet. Paul Livingston sat in his leather armchair, a crystal tumbler in hand. The amber liquid within barely stirred as his grip tightened, his knuckles pale against the glass. Above the mantel, a portrait of Virginia gazed down at him, her smile frozen in an expression of warmth he hadn't felt in years. She wore that red dress, the one she'd insisted on wearing every Christmas, despite his grumbling about its impracticality. Because it's festive, she'd say with a laugh, her fingers always quick to adjust a bauble or ribbon. Don't you see, Robert? Christmas isn't Christmas without joy. He lifted his glass, the whiskey sharp against his throat. The words had been meaningless to him then. Now they echoed in the stillness, mocking him. The massive tree in the corner of the room stood bare, its branches accusing him in their nakedness. Virginia had always insisted on decorating it together, turning the task into an event, complete with mulled wine, Christmas records, and her endless stream of holiday cheer. But this year, the tree was a shadow, a reminder of traditions long dead. A sharp knock startled him, the sound alien against the cocoon of quiet. Paul set his glass down with deliberate care and checked his watch. 9:30. The staff had been dismissed hours ago. Who would come here, uninvited, on Christmas Eve? The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Sighing, he rose. His footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he crossed the cavernous foyer. When he pulled open the heavy oak door, a gust of cold air swept inside, and with it came two figures, small, trembling, and impossibly young. The boy stepped forward first, his face pinched with cold. "Please, sir, we need help." Paul blinked, momentarily speechless. The girl, slightly smaller, clung to the boy's hand, her eyes wide and luminous under the porch light. Both were wrapped in thin coats that seemed more like suggestions of warmth than actual protection against the biting air. They are twins. "Who sent you?" His voice came out harsher than intended, his years of negotiating and commanding boardrooms bleeding into his tone. The boy hesitated, but squared his shoulders. "No one sent us. We thought maybe someone here could help." Paul studied them, his practiced gaze, noting the worn seams on their clothes, the smudges on their cheeks, and the red patches on their exposed skin. "Help with what?" "Our mother," the girl said, her voice barely audible. "She's sick. She needs medicine, but we don't have enough." Paul frowned, his mind scrambling for logic in the absurdity of the situation. Strangers didn't knock on doors in his world, not unless they were delivering packages or asking for donations. "Why would you come here? There are shelters, organizations." The boy interrupted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "We tried. They said everything's closed for Christmas." Something in his tone, a mix of desperation and defiance, cut through Robert's practiced detachment. He leaned against the doorframe, his breath misting in the night air. "Where do you live?" The girl answered this time, pointing toward the darker stretch of the neighborhood that bordered the estate. "Not far. It's a small place." Robert's mind flickered with images of cramped apartments and peeling wallpaper. He knew of the area, having driven through it in the back of his town car, the windows tinted to blur the reality outside. He exhaled, the sound more like a growl. "Wait here." The children exchanged nervous glances, but didn't move. When Paul returned, a crisp $100 bill in hand, their eyes widened. "This should cover the medicine," he said, holding it out. "Get your mother what she needs." The boy reached for it, his hands shaking not just from the cold. "Thank you, sir. Really, thank you." The girl whispered something to her brother, but he shook his head, tugging her hand. "We have to go." As Paul closed the door, the wind carried their faint voices away. For a moment, he stood in the empty foyer, staring at the locked door as if it might summon them back. But the silence returned, enveloping the house once more. He picked up his glass, but the whiskey tasted bitter now, the burn hollow against the growing knot in his chest. From the mantel, Virginia's painted eyes seemed to follow him, her expression inscrutable. "You'd have invited them in," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You'd have made cocoa or something." The room offered no reply, only the soft hiss of the dying fire. The heavy oak door groaned as Paul swung it open again. The cold air sliced through the warmth of the foyer, biting against his skin. He scanned the driveway, catching sight of the two children trudging down the snow-dusted path, their small figures nearly swallowed by the night. "Wait!" he called out, his voice sharper than he intended. The boy stopped first, turning back with a guarded expression. The girl tugged on his sleeve, her steps hesitant as she followed his lead. They stood in the dim glow of the porch light, their breath visible in the icy air. Paul adjusted his stance, unsure why he'd stopped them. He gestured stiffly toward the open door. "Come back inside. You'll freeze out here." The boy hesitated, his body angled protectively in front of the girl. "We're fine, sir. We don't want to bother you." "You already have," Paul said bluntly, though the edge in his tone softened as he noticed how the girl shivered despite her brother's attempt to shield her. "Now, get inside before I change my mind." That did it. The boy gave a short nod, gripping the girl's hand as they shuffled past Paul and into the expansive foyer. Their footsteps, muffled by worn-out sneakers, left damp imprints on the polished floor. The space, with its towering ceilings and pristine decor, seemed to engulf them completely. "Stay here," Paul instructed, closing the door behind them. He motioned toward the sitting room just beyond the entryway, its fire casting a warm orange glow. By the fire, the girl's wide eyes darted around the room as they moved toward the hearth, her curiosity tempered by caution. The boy remained stoic, his gaze fixed on Robert, his shoulders squared as if preparing for a confrontation. Paul leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, and studied them for a moment. "What's your name?" The boy spoke first. "Tommy." His voice was steady, but his fingers fidgeted with the frayed hem of his coat. He nodded toward his sister. "This is Laurie." "And your mother?" Paul pressed, his tone clipped. "What's wrong with her?" Laurie glanced at Tommy before answering. "She's really sick. Fever, coughing all the time. She can't get out of bed." Her voice was small, but her words were clear. "And no one else could help?" Paul asked, narrowing his eyes. "Why come here?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. "We tried," he said. "Shelters, clinics. Everything's closed tonight. Someone said this place... Well, they said you might..." He trailed off, glancing at Laurie, who looked at the floor. "Who?" Robert's voice sharpened. "Who told you to come here?" Tommy opened his mouth but closed it again, his expression unreadable. Laurie fumbled with her coat sleeve, speaking up instead. "Someone used to help us before. They said we could find help here if we really needed it." Paul frowned, their vagueness grating against his patience. "This someone, why didn't they help you now?" Laurie flinched at his tone, but Tommy stepped forward, his chin lifting. "They're gone. Okay? We came because we didn't know what else to do." Paul was taken aback by the boy's defiance, his words both sharp and vulnerable. He sighed, running a hand over his face. "Fine. Wait here." He disappeared into the adjacent study, the sound of a drawer sliding open echoing faintly. When he returned, he held a crisp bill in his hand. "Use it to buy food." Tommy reached for it, but Paul hesitated, narrowing his eyes. "How do I know this isn't a scam? That you're not here spinning stories for handouts?" Tommy's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "We're not lying," he said through gritted teeth. "Our mum's sick. If you don't want to help, fine, but don't call us liars." "Tommy," Laurie whispered, tugging at his sleeve, her voice trembling. "It's okay." Paul studied the boy's rigid posture, the flicker of humiliation in his eyes. Something about it stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. He exhaled, his grip on the bill loosening as he handed it over. "Here, get what you need." Tommy took the money, his movements stiff and mechanical. "Thank you," he muttered, though his gratitude sounded more like an obligation than sincerity. Laurie managed a small smile, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, sir. Really." Paul nodded curtly, avoiding her gaze. "Go home. It's late." The children turned to leave, their small forms illuminated briefly by the firelight before vanishing into the cold night. Paul closed the door behind them, the latch clicking into place with a finality that unsettled him. Back in the sitting room, he poured himself another drink, but the whiskey didn't taste the same. Something about the encounter clung to him, like the lingering chill from the open door. He glanced at Virginia's portrait above the mantel, her painted smile as warm and knowing as ever. The room, as always, quiet. The morning was still, the air crisp with winter's bite, as Paul Livingston walked through the snow-covered paths of the cemetery. His polished shoes left deliberate imprints, the only sign of movement in the pristine landscape. The sky above was a pale grey, heavy with the promise of more snow. Phoenix rarely saw such chill, but Christmas mornings had taken on a colder, more solemn meaning for Paul since Virginia's passing. In his hand, he held a bouquet of white roses, Virginia's favorite. Every year since her death, he made this pilgrimage, a silent ritual in honor of the woman who had brought light to his otherwise mechanical life. The words on her headstone came into view as he approached. "Loved always, by all she touched." He knelt, brushing a layer of snow from the base of the grave before laying the roses down carefully. His gloved fingers lingered on the cold stone, tracing the letters of her name as a sigh escaped him. "You always had the warmth I lacked," he murmured, his breath visible in the icy air. "And look what's left without you." A rustling sound caught his attention, faint but distinct in the stillness. He straightened and turned toward the noise, his brow furrowing as he spotted two small figures kneeling at the opposite side of the grave. Their heads were bowed, hands fumbling with a scrappy bouquet of wildflowers. The boy was placing the flowers neatly, while the girl adjusted her scarf against the cold. For a moment, Paul simply stared, disbelief freezing him in place. It was them, the children from last night. "What the—" He began walking toward them, his voice echoing in the quiet. "You too, again." The boy tensed, turning to face him with a look of wary defiance. The girl stood quickly, tugging on the boy's sleeve, her expression wide-eyed and uncertain. "What are you doing here? In front of my wife's grave?" Paul demanded, though his tone was less sharp than intended. His gaze flicked to the grave they were attending, Virginia's grave. The girl stepped forward hesitantly, her boots crunching softly in the snow. We came to thank her." "Thank her?" Paul echoed, his voice dropping in confusion. "What do you mean?" The boy, Tommy, moved protectively in front of his sister. "She helped us," he said firmly, though his voice trembled slightly. "She always helped." Robert's eyes narrowed, his gaze darting between the two. "Helped you? How? When?" Laurie glanced at her brother before speaking, her voice soft but steady. "Mrs. Virginia. She was our godmother. She helped us when no one else would. She brought food, medicine, clothes. She cared." The words hit Paul with a forceful impact. He stepped back, his face hardening to mask the storm raging inside him. "Virginia never mentioned you. Never said a word." "Maybe she didn't think you'd care," Tommy said bluntly, crossing his arms. His words landed sharply, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of hesitation. "Tommy!" Laurie hissed, nudging him urgently. "Don't." The boy looked away, muttering something under his breath. Laurie stepped forward again, her gaze steady despite the tension in her shoulders. "Mrs. Virginia told us about you," she said. "She said you were a busy man, but she always believed in you." Robert's chest tightened. "Believed in me?" His voice was quieter now, almost incredulous. "What did she say?" "She said you had a kind heart," Laurie replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said you just didn't know how to show it." The girl's words resonated in the chilly atmosphere, piercing the quietness with a sharp edge. Paul stared at her, the weight of her statement pressing down on him in a way he couldn't quite describe. His gaze dropped to the wildflowers they'd brought, small, fragile, yet somehow vibrant against the stark white snow. "She believed in me," Paul repeated under his breath, as if trying to comprehend the idea. He looked back at the grave, his jaw tightening. Virginia had always seen more in him than he had ever seen in himself. Tommy cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We didn't mean to bother you," he said, his tone softer now. "We just wanted to bring her something. It's not much, but—" Paul shook his head, gesturing toward the flowers. "It's more than I've done," he admitted bitterly, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Laurie and Tommy exchanged a glance, unsure of what to say. Paul took a steadying breath, his gloved hand brushing over the top of Virginia's headstone. "Go home," he said finally, his voice firm but not unkind. "It's cold. You shouldn't be out here." The children nodded, their movements hesitant. As they turned to leave, Laurie paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly, though for what? Paul wasn't sure. He watched them disappear down the snowy path before turning back to the grave. The silence returned, but it felt heavier now, filled with questions he didn't yet have answers for. "Virginia," he murmured, his fingers curling into fists. "What else did I miss?" The snow began to fall again, soft and unrelenting, as if the world itself mourned alongside him. The warmth of the mansion greeted Paulus. He stepped inside, but it did little to thaw the cold knot forming in his chest. The echoes of Laurie's words, "She always believed in you," reverberated in his mind as he stood in the silent foyer. Virginia's portrait loomed above the mantel, her painted smile serene and knowing, as if she were daring him to unravel the truths she'd left behind. He set the bouquet of white roses on the console table and shrugged off his coat, his movements uncharacteristically mechanical. The children's visit had stirred something he didn't yet understand, a gnawing curiosity paired with an undeniable sense of guilt. How had Virginia managed to weave her life so deeply into others without him noticing? The answer, he suspected, lay in her study. The room had remained untouched since her passing. The faint scent of lavender lingered, a ghost of her presence. The soft amber light from the desk lamp illuminated a tidy workspace. Notebooks stacked neatly, pens arranged in a porcelain cup, and a locked drawer in the bottom right corner. Paul sat in her chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight. His fingers hovered over the drawer's brass handle before retrieving the key from a small bowl on the desk. The drawer effortlessly opened, unveiling an abundance of documents and handwritten notes. He unfolded a thick envelope labeled "Families to Help." Inside were detailed profiles, names, addresses, and personal circumstances. Each entry was annotated in Virginia's flowing script. There were budgets, reminders about follow-up visits, and even snippets of encouraging messages she had written to each family. His breath hitched as he skimmed through the pages. Virginia's care and attention to detail were staggering. These weren't acts of casual charity, they were intimate acts of love. One name caught his eye: Ana Rodriguez. The name was familiar, though he couldn't immediately place it. He flipped through the corresponding file, his eyes narrowing as the details clicked into place. Ana was a former employee of a small factory he'd acquired during an aggressive expansion several years ago. A wave of discomfort settled over him as he read further. Position: assembly line worker, terminated after factory restructuring. Current circumstances: unemployed. Sole provider for 2 children. Medical bills increasing. Chronic illness. The realization hit him with brutal clarity. Ana was Laurie and Tommy's mother. Paul leaned back in the chair, his hands trembling slightly as he set the file down. He remembered the acquisition well, how swiftly he had approved the layoffs, cutting costs to maximize profits. This decision, among others, solidified his reputation as a ruthless deal-maker. He hadn't spared a thought for the hundreds of lives disrupted by that decision. But Virginia had. She had quietly stepped in where he had caused harm, piecing together the wreckage of his actions with compassion he hadn't deserved. The thought was like a knife, twisting in his chest. He opened another notebook, its pages filled with plans for something called the Virginia Loving Foundation. It was a comprehensive blueprint for a charitable organization dedicated to helping displaced workers, single parents, and struggling families, people like Ana. "I wanted to name it after us," Virginia had written in a note tucked inside the cover. "But I thought you'd find it indulgent. So it will be just me, but you'll be in every part of it, Robert, whether you know it or not." The words blurred as his vision grew unsteady. He set the notebook down, his pulse pounding in his ears. For years, he had persuaded himself that his icy efficiency was a valuable asset. Yet here, in the quiet sanctum of Virginia's world, he was confronted with the undeniable truth. His strength had left others broken, and Virginia had spent her life quietly repairing the fractures he had caused. The weight of her actions crushed him. She hadn't judged or scolded him. She had simply acted, filling the void he had left behind with her endless kindness. Paul sat for a long time, staring at the open files, his thoughts tangled in guilt and grief. His wife, the woman he had loved but never truly understood, had been fighting battles he hadn't even seen. He reached for the notebook again, his fingers brushing against the words she had written. For the first time in years, a spark of something unfamiliar flickered in his chest. It wasn't just regret. It was resolve. "Virginia," he murmured, his voice breaking in the quiet of the study. "I'll make it right. Somehow." The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the mansion in a deceptive calm, but within its walls, Paul Livingston sat surrounded by the echoes of his wife's compassion, finally beginning to see the path she had left for him to follow. The neighborhood wasn't one Paul Livingston had visited before. The narrow streets were lined with modest houses, many of them showing signs of wear, peeling paint, sagging porches, and patches of dirt where lawns once thrived. His sleek black sedan, parked along the curb, seemed out of place, its glossy surface reflecting the muted grey of the overcast sky. He double-checked the address scrawled in Virginia's notes and stepped out, clutching a small box of groceries. The air was brisk, and his breath clouded as he approached the small, weathered house. The door opened before he knocked. Tommy stood there, his gaze sharp and wary. Behind him, Laurie peeked out, her expression uncertain. "You again," Tommy said, his voice guarded. "What are you doing here?" "I need to speak to your mother," Paul replied, his tone even. "Is she home?" The boy hesitated, his fingers gripping the doorframe. "She's resting." "She's been sick." Laurie stepped forward, her voice softer. "She'll want to see him, Tommy." After a long pause, Tommy sighed and stepped aside. Paul entered the house, ducking slightly to clear the low doorway. The inside was sparse, but clean. The living room was dominated by a faded couch, and a small heater buzzed in the corner, struggling to warm the air. "Wait here," Laurie said, motioning for him to sit. She disappeared down a narrow hallway, while Tommy lingered near the door, his arms crossed, as if to shield himself from Robert's presence. Moments later, Laurie returned, guiding a frail woman into the room. Ana Rodriguez was thin, her skin pale, and her movements slow, but her eyes were sharp, carrying a mix of weariness and pride. "Mr. Livingston," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "I wasn't expecting a visit." Paul stood, setting the grocery box on the small table. "I'm sorry to disturb you. He paused, searching for the right words. "I recently learned about the help Virginia provided to you and your family." Anna's expression softened at the mention of Virginia. "She was an angel," she said simply. "We wouldn't have made it without her." "I didn't know," Paul admitted. The words felt heavy, inadequate. "I didn't realize the impact she had, or the damage I caused." Anna studied him for a moment, before nodding toward the couch. "Sit down," she said, her tone kind but firm. "You look like a man with something on his mind." Paul sat, his posture stiff. "Virginia had plans," he began, "for something bigger, a foundation to help families like yours. I didn't know about it until recently, but I want to make it happen." Anna's brow furrowed. "That's a noble idea. But why now?" He hesitated, his fingers clasped tightly together. "Because I owe it to her, and to the people I've hurt." For a moment, the room was silent except for the low hum of the heater. Then Anna leaned forward, her voice quiet but firm. "If you're serious about this, don't just do it for her. Do it because you believe it's right." Her words lingered as he drove back to his mansion. The foundation wasn't just about honoring Virginia. It was about reclaiming something within himself, something he hadn't realized was missing. 2 weeks later, Paul stood in the boardroom of Livingston Enterprises, the polished table reflecting the determined set of his jaw. Around him, his shareholders exchanged skeptical glances. "This is a waste of resources," one of them argued. "We're a business, not a charity." "It's reckless," another added. "Our reputation is built on efficiency and profit. This could undermine everything we've worked for." Paul held up a hand, silencing the room. "Our reputation," he said, his voice calm but unyielding, "is built on success at any cost. That's not something I'm proud of anymore." A murmur spread through the room, disbelief etched on every face. "This foundation isn't up for debate," Paul continued. "I've already begun the process. If necessary, I'll fund it myself." "You're putting your personal finances at risk," a senior board member asked incredulously. "For what?" "For something that matters," Paul replied. "For people who've been overlooked because of decisions I made." The room fell silent. The weight of his words hung in the air, challenging the unspoken values that had driven the company for years. "You're risking alienating investors," one of the younger members said cautiously. "This could backfire." Paul responded, "So be it." His gaze swept across the room, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "This company has enough success to survive a little decency." With that, he walked out, leaving the stunned board members to process his decision. That evening, as he sat alone in his study, Paul opened Virginia's notebook once more. His fingers brushed against her handwriting, each word a reminder of the woman who had believed in him, even when he hadn't deserved it. "Virginia," he murmured, his voice quiet but resolute, "I'll see this through." Outside, the Phoenix skyline glimmered in years. Paul felt a flicker of warmth return to his heart. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to face it. The community hall was packed, its modest space humming with murmurs of anticipation and skepticism. Folding chairs lined the room, filled with weary faces of factory workers, single parents, and struggling families. The air was thick with curiosity. Many had heard whispers of a man who once epitomized corporate greed, now trying to champion charity. The name Paul Livingston had brought them here, and with it, a simmering undercurrent of resentment. Paul stood near the front, adjusting his tie out of habit more than nerves. He scanned the crowd, their expectant faces a stark contrast to the polished boardrooms he was used to. This wasn't his arena, but he was here nonetheless, guided by something greater than comfort or reputation. Behind him hung a simple banner that read, "The Virginia Loving Foundation, building hope for families in need." He stepped forward to the small podium, its microphone crackling faintly as he adjusted it. The room quieted, a collective hush falling over the gathered crowd. "Good evening," Paul began, his voice steady but lacking its usual corporate polish. "Many of you know me, or rather, you know of me. My name is Paul Livingston, and I'm here because of my late wife, Virginia." The mention of her name softened a few faces in the crowd. Others, however, remained stoic, their arms crossed and expressions guarded. "Virginia believed in helping those who had been overlooked," Paul continued. "She dedicated her life to supporting families in need, often in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Today, I stand here not as the man you may think I am, but as someone trying to honor her vision. The Virginia Loving Foundation is my way of continuing her work." For a brief moment, the room was silent, his words hanging in the air. Then, a voice from the back cut through the quiet. "Honor her vision? You mean after you destroyed ours?" All heads turned to see a man rise from his seat, his face flushed with anger. "You shut down our factory, Livingston, left us with nothing, and now you want to play the hero." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd as others nodded in agreement. Another voice chimed in, this one a woman's. "Do you think throwing money at us will erase what you did? We lost our jobs, our homes, because of you." Paul gripped the edges of the podium, the accusations striking him harder than he expected. He had prepared for skepticism, but not for this raw, unfiltered anger. The voices grew louder, merging into a cacophony of blame. "You ruined lives, Livingston. Why should we trust you now? Is this just another tax write-off for you?" He stood there, absorbing every word. His instinct was to defend himself, to explain that his intentions were genuine, but he knew that words alone wouldn't mend what he had broken. He glanced down at his hands, clenched against the wood of the podium, and forced himself to breathe. "Stop it!" A small, clear voice cut through the noise. The crowd fell silent as Laurie stepped forward, her small figure dwarfed by the adults around her. She looked out at the sea of faces, her expression timid but determined. "Mrs. Virginia believed in him," she said, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "She told us he had a kind heart, even if he didn't always show it. And she was right. Mr. Livingston has already helped my family, and he's trying to help all of you now. Tommy followed close behind her, his gaze steady and unflinching. Yeah, he made mistakes, the boy added. Big ones. But he's here to fix them. If Mrs. Virginia believed in him, maybe we should give him a chance too. The children's words hung in the air, their sincerity cutting through the crowd's anger. A few heads nodded, though others still seemed unconvinced. The hostility had softened, but it hadn't disappeared entirely. Paul finally found his voice, though it was quieter now. You're right, he said, addressing the room. I made decisions that hurt people. I can't undo what's been done, but I can try to make things better. The Virginia Loving Foundation isn't about me, it's about all of you, and the future we can build together. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, a smattering of applause broke out, hesitant at first, but growing in strength. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. Later that evening, as the crowd dispersed, Paul stood outside the hall, the cold night air biting at his skin. Laurie and Tommy stood beside him, their small hands clutching his coat. Thank you, Paul said, his voice low, for what you said in there. Laurie shrugged, her cheeks pink from the cold. We just told the truth. Tommy looked up at him, his expression serious. Don't mess it up. A faint smile tugged at Robert's lips. I'll try not to. As they walked to his car, the faint sound of laughter and chatter echoed behind them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was hope. And for Robert, that was enough to keep going. The Virginia Loving Foundation began with a quiet hum of activity, small efforts that slowly grew into meaningful change. The first initiatives were modest, providing groceries to struggling families, covering medical expenses, and offering temporary housing. Paul was adamant about starting quickly, but he soon realized that his wife's vision required more than money. It needed heart, persistence, and connection. He spent his mornings at the foundation office, a modest building nestled in a busy Phoenix neighborhood, its freshly painted sign a stark contrast to the worn storefronts around it. Inside, desks buzzed with activity as volunteers sorted donations, answered calls, and compiled case files. Paul was often among them, unrecognizable from the detached businessman he had once been. Everyone changes, right? Do you like your present or past self better? Share it with us in the comments. One afternoon, as Paul reviewed grant proposals at his desk, a knock interrupted him. He looked up to find Laurie and Tommy standing in the doorway, their presence as natural as if they'd always belonged there. Brought you coffee, Laurie said, holding out a paper cup. Her smile was shy, but genuine. And donuts, Tommy added, plopping a crumpled bag on the desk. We thought you'd need it. Robert's lips quirked into a rare smile as he accepted the offerings. You two are going to spoil me, he said dryly, though his tone carried a warmth he rarely allowed himself to show. Someone has to, Tommy replied, his grin cheeky. The children had become a fixture in Robert's life, visiting the foundation regularly after school. They helped organize supplies and even suggested ideas for community events. Their presence brought an unexpected lightness to his days, filling corners of his heart he hadn't realized were empty. Balancing the foundation's growing demands with his corporate responsibilities, however, proved challenging. Late-night phone calls with disgruntled shareholders became routine. They questioned his dedication to the company, citing falling profits and perceived distractions. You can't run a charity and a corporation, Robert, one senior executive had said during a particularly tense meeting. You're overextended. But Robert's resolve only hardened. Then maybe the company needs to learn to stand on its own, he had replied, his tone final. I've spent years chasing numbers. Now it's time to chase something that matters. The challenges didn't end with the boardroom. Setbacks at the foundation manifested as logistical nightmares, miscommunications, and the overwhelming realization that the need in Phoenix significantly exceeded their resources. Families came with stories of eviction, medical emergencies, and the slow erosion of hope. Each case was a reminder of the lives he had indirectly impacted through his relentless pursuit of profit. One day, while visiting a family newly placed in temporary housing, Paul noticed a child clinging to a threadbare teddy bear, its seams splitting. The sight struck him in an unfamiliar way, a pang of guilt and determination threading through his chest. Later that evening, back at the foundation, Laurie found him poring over inventory lists, a frown etched deep on his face. "What's wrong?" she asked, perching on the edge of his desk. "There's so much to do," Paul admitted, leaning back in his chair. "It seems as though we're just beginning to explore the possibilities." Laurie tilted her head thoughtfully. "Mrs. Virginia always said you can't fix everything at once. You just start small and keep going." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of Virginia's wisdom. Paul nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Smart woman, your godmother." "She believed in you, you know," Laurie added softly. "So do we." As the weeks progressed into months, the foundation started to establish its own rhythm. Community events brought neighbors together, and success stories started to trickle in. A family finally moving into permanent housing, a child receiving life-saving medical treatment, a single mother finding stable work. These victories, though small, carried immense significance for Robert. His interactions with the families became more frequent and personal. At first, he had approached them with formality, but over time, his guarded demeanor softened. He listened to their stories, shook their hands, and even laughed with their children. The cold mask he had worn for so many years began to melt, revealing a man capable of connection and empathy. One evening, as he locked up the foundation office, Laurie and Tommy waited for him by the car. The setting sun bathed the street in warm hues, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. "Big day tomorrow," Tommy said, climbing into the back seat. "Community picnic. You better not embarrass us." "Embarrass you?" Paul asked, raising an eyebrow. "Who's been organizing it all week?" "Doesn't mean you won't mess it up," Tommy teased, earning a playful nudge from Laurie. As Paul started the car, he glanced at the rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of the two children laughing in the back seat. Their easy camaraderie, their resilience despite everything they had endured, it was humbling. For the first time in years, Paul felt something akin to peace. The road ahead remained difficult, but he was no longer walking it alone. Laurie and Tommy had become more than visitors. They were family, tethering him to a purpose that stretched beyond his own redemption. As the car pulled away, the foundation's sign glinted in the fading light, its bold letters a promise of the work yet to come. The community picnic was alive with the buzz of laughter and conversation. Families gathered in the park, their voices mingling with the faint strains of music drifting from a makeshift stage. Children chased each other across the grass, their joyful squeals punctuating the crisp afternoon air. The scent of grilled food wafted through the area, blending with the sweetness of the flowers in bloom. Paul stood at the edge of the gathering, scanning the scene. This was Virginia's vision, made tangible. A community united by hope and support. Yet despite the warmth of the day, a lingering doubt gnawed at him. Could this truly be enough? "Mr. Livingston," the voice broke through his thoughts. He turned to see an elderly man approaching, his cane tapping rhythmically against the pavement. Behind him trailed a woman and a teenage boy, both carrying trays of food. "I just wanted to say thank you," the man said, extending a weathered hand. "You and your foundation helped me keep my house. I thought I'd have to leave the only place I've called home, but you stepped in." Paul clasped his hand firmly, nodding. I'm glad we could help." The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling with emotion. "When my husband got sick, we had nowhere to turn. Your wife, Mrs. Virginia, she brought us groceries every week until he recovered. I don't know where we'd be without her." Hearing Virginia's name spoken with such reverence left Paul momentarily speechless. He managed a quiet, "She would have been glad to hear that." The teenage boy, who had been silent until now, glanced up. "She told me I could be anything I wanted," he said. "I'm going to college next year because of her. And because of you." The words struck something deep within Robert. He smiled faintly, watching as the family moved on, their gratitude lingering like a tangible presence. Throughout the afternoon, more families approached him with similar stories. Each one painted a clearer picture of Virginia's quiet heroism, her tireless efforts to uplift others, her unwavering belief in the good that could come from even the smallest act of kindness. Later that evening, as the last of the picnic tables were folded and the park emptied, Paul sat on a bench near the playground. Laurie and Tommy played tag with a group of children, their laughter ringing across the darkening field. "She really was remarkable, wasn't she?" Paul murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "She was," came a voice beside him. He turned to see Anna, bundled in a thick coat, walking slowly toward the bench. Her face was paler than he remembered, and her frame seemed frailer, but her eyes still carried the sharpness that had first struck him. "Anna," he said, standing instinctively. "You shouldn't be out here in this cold." She waved off his concern, sinking onto the bench beside him. "I wanted to see this," she said, motioning to the picnic area. "Virginia would have been so proud of you." Paul sat back down, his shoulders heavy with a mix of gratitude and guilt. "I'm just following her lead." Anna smiled faintly. "You're doing more than that. She always said you had a kind heart. You're proving her right." Her words settled over him like a weight, pressing against his chest. He turned to look at her more closely, noting the shallow rise and fall of her breaths, the strain in her posture. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his tone careful but insistent. She hesitated before replying, her voice softer now. "Some days are better than others. But I'm tired, Robert. I've been fatigued for a long time." The gravity of her words hit him immediately. He leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Anna, if there's anything we can do to help, you've already done so much," she interrupted gently, "more than I could have asked for. And you're taking care of my kids. That's all I need." The finality in her tone was impossible to ignore. Paul felt the knot in his chest tighten as he searched for something to say, something that could push back the inevitability of her words. But Anna reached out, placing a frail hand over his. "Promise me," she said, her gaze steady. "Promise me you'll keep them safe, that you'll give them the life I couldn't." He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. That night, back at the foundation office, Paul sat alone at his desk. The stories he'd heard throughout the day echoed in his mind, interwoven with Anna's quiet plea. Virginia's work had touched so many lives, and now it was his responsibility to ensure that legacy endured. He opened Virginia's notebook, running his fingers over her neat handwriting. Each word, each carefully crafted plan, was a reminder of her faith in him. For the first time, he didn't feel burdened by it. Instead, he felt empowered. "Virginia," he murmured, his voice resolute. "I'll see it through. For you. For them." As he closed the notebook, the distant sound of children's laughter drifted through the open window. It was a reminder of what truly mattered, and a promise of the work still to come. The call came early one morning, interrupting the quiet hum of Robert's daily routine. He was in his study, reviewing plans for the next phase of the Foundation's outreach programs, when the phone rang. He recognized Laurie's voice immediately, but it was trembling, unsteady. "It's Mom," she whispered. She's not doing well. The doctor says—" Her voice broke, and Tommy's muffled voice came through, steadying her. "I'm on my way," Paul said without hesitation, already grabbing his coat. Anna's small home felt heavier than usual. The warmth from the heater failed to cut through the solemn atmosphere. Paul stepped inside, greeted by Tommy's firm handshake and Laurie's tear-streaked face. The siblings led him to the bedroom, where Anna lay propped against a mountain of pillows, her frail frame nearly swallowed by the blankets. She turned her head at the sound of his footsteps and managed a weak smile. "Robert," she rasped. "Didn't think you'd come so fast." "I came as soon as I heard," he replied, pulling a chair closer to her bedside. He reached for her hand, startled by how cool and fragile it felt in his grasp. "How are you feeling?" Her laugh was a faint, dry sound, like a cliché. Weak, tired, all those things they write about in books. He didn't smile. "Anna—" "Don't," she interrupted gently, her eyes meeting his with quiet determination. "We both know where this is going. There's no need to pretend." The room fell silent, except for the rhythmic hum of the heater. Paul looked away, his gaze falling to the worn rug beneath his feet. "It's not fair," he muttered. "No," Anna agreed, "but life rarely is." The children lingered in the doorway as Paul stayed by Anna's side. She spoke in a soft voice, asking about the foundation, the families they'd helped, and Laurie and Tommy's roles in it. When her strength waned, she leaned back against the pillows, her breathing shallow but steady. "Robert," she said after a long pause, "I need you to promise me something." "You know you don't need to ask," he replied, his voice thick. Her gaze, though tired, was unwavering. "Promise me you'll take care of them. Laurie and Tommy. They're wonderful kids. But they've lost so much already. They need someone to lean on. Someone who'll love them." Robert's throat tightened, and he struggled to find words. "You have my word," he said finally. "I'll take care of them. I'll give them everything they need." Anna nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. "I always knew Virginia was right about you." Anna passed away quietly that evening, with Laurie and Tommy by her side. Paul stayed until the end, his hand never leaving hers. When the time came, he guided the children out of the room, his arms around their shoulders as they clung to him. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and condolences. Paul took charge of everything, making sure Anna was buried with dignity and grace. Laurie and Tommy stayed close to him, their grief raw and unfiltered, but eased by his steady presence. It was on a quiet morning after the funeral that Paul made his decision. Sitting at his kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands, he realized the depth of his responsibility and his desire to be more than a guardian to Laurie and Tommy. They had become his family, and he would honor Anna's memory by becoming the father they needed. The adoption process moved swiftly, thanks to his resources, but Paul was determined to be involved in every step. When the paperwork was finalized, Laurie and Tommy moved into his mansion, their laughter and presence transforming the once silent halls into a home. Becoming a father wasn't without its challenges. Paul was used to managing numbers, not teenagers with their own personalities and needs. Laurie often sought his reassurance, her quiet nature masking a deep vulnerability, while Tommy's sharp wit sometimes clashed with Robert's stern demeanor. But over time, they found their rhythm. Sunday mornings became pancake breakfasts in the kitchen, with Laurie flipping batter while Tommy teased her about her uneven circles. Weeknights often ended with board games at the dining table, where Robert's competitive streak emerged, much to the children's delight. Gradually, the fractures in their lives started to mend. One evening, as the three of them sat in the living room, Tommy turned to Robert, his voice unusually serious. "Why'd you do it?" he asked. "Why take us in?" Paul set down his book and met the boy's gaze. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said simply. "Because your mother trusted me. And because I care about you." Laurie, curled up with a blanket on the couch, smiled faintly. "Mum would be happy," she said softly. Paul looked at them, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and gratitude. "She would," he agreed. "And so am I." For the first time in years, Paul felt whole. The void Virginia had left behind wasn't filled, but it was no longer a hollow ache. Laurie and Tommy had become his anchor, their presence grounding him in a life filled with purpose and love. As the night wore on, the three of them sat together, the weight of their shared past lightened by the bonds they had forged. And in that moment, Paul knew he wasn't just honoring Anna's memory or Virginia's legacy. He was building something new, something enduring, for all of them. 15 years later, the Virginia Loving Foundation remained a steadfast symbol of hope in Phoenix. What had begun as a modest effort to honor Virginia's legacy had grown into a multifaceted organization providing housing, education, job training, and medical care to thousands. The foundation's impact stretched beyond the city, inspiring similar initiatives across the country. At the heart of it all was Paul Livingston, whose name had transformed from one of corporate greed to one synonymous with redemption. Foundation newsletters featured his face, and his speeches at charity galas garnered standing ovations. But it wasn't the applause or the accolades that fueled him. It was the faces of the families they had helped, the children who now had a chance at a future, the lives mended in ways he had once thought impossible. The Livingston Mansion, once a cold monument to wealth, had been reborn into a home, alive with love and purpose. Laurie and Tommy, now young adults, had grown into thoughtful, driven leaders. Laurie, with her quiet strength and keen organizational mind, managed the foundation's day-to-day operations. Tommy, bold and charismatic, spearheaded community outreach, his charm and sincerity winning over even the most skeptical audiences. Paul took immense pride in them, though he often wondered if they truly realized how much they had shaped him in return. Their influence had softened his edges, taught him patience, and filled his life with a sense of meaning he hadn't known he craved. One crisp autumn afternoon, Paul sat in the foundation's garden, now a lush oasis of greenery and vibrant blooms. A group of children played nearby, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Laurie approached, holding a tablet with updates on a new housing project. "Everything's on track," she said, sitting beside him. "We'll be able to break ground next month." Paul nodded, his eyes fixed on the children. "You've done well, Laurie. Better than I ever could have imagined." She smiled, resting a hand on his. "We learned from the best." Tommy joined them moments later, a clipboard in hand and a wide grin on his face. "Don't let her hog all the credit, old man. I have also been contributing significantly." Paul chuckled, shaking his head. "That, I don't doubt." The three of them sat together, the garden's tranquility wrapping around them. For Robert, these moments were the culmination of everything he had worked toward. Not just the foundation's success, but the family they had built together. As the years passed, Paul began to step back, trusting Laurie and Tommy to carry the foundation forward. His twilight years were spent mentoring them, sharing the wisdom he had earned through mistakes and redemption. They listened intently, their admiration evident, though they often reminded him he'd earned his rest. One quiet morning, Paul sat in his study, a cup of tea cooling on the desk beside him. He looked around at the familiar space, the walls adorned with photos of Virginia, Anna, Laurie, and Tommy. Each image told a story, a legacy of love, loss, and second chances. The door creaked open, and Laurie stepped inside, her expression soft. "You've been in here a while," Everything okay? Paul smiled, gesturing for her to join him. Just reminiscing. She sat beside him, glancing at the photos. You've done so much, Dad. More than anyone could have asked. He reached for her hand, his grip gentle but firm. It wasn't just me. It was Virginia, Anna, and you two. You gave me something to believe in. She leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of unspoken gratitude filling the room. Paul passed away peacefully that evening, surrounded by Laurie and Tommy. His final words were simple, yet profound. Take care of each other, and keep the light alive. At his funeral, the community gathered to honor the man who had once been a symbol of ambition and cold efficiency, but had transformed into a champion of compassion. Laurie and Tommy spoke with heartfelt eloquence, sharing stories of the father who had guided them, the mentor who had shaped them, and the man who had shown them the power of redemption. The foundation carried on, thriving under Laurie and Tommy's leadership. Each year, on the anniversary of Robert's passing, they held a celebration in his honor, bringing together families and friends to reflect on his life and the enduring impact of his work. On one such anniversary, Laurie and Tommy visited Robert's grave. The cemetery was quiet, except for the gentle rustling of leaves in the cold winter breeze. Snow fell softly, blanketing the ground in pristine white, its silence amplifying the weight of the moment. Laurie and Tommy walked side by side, their steps deliberate as they made their way to the cluster of graves beneath a towering oak tree. In Laurie's arms was a bouquet of white roses, their petals crisp and delicate against the cold. Tommy carried a small lantern, its warm glow flickering steadily despite the chill. The siblings moved with an unspoken understanding, their bond shaped by years of shared loss, growth, and purpose. They stopped at the first headstone, Virginia Livingston, a light that never fades. Laurie knelt, placing the bouquet gently at its base. "Hi, Mrs. Virginia," she said softly, her voice carrying a mixture of reverence and warmth. "We miss you." Tommy adjusted the lantern, setting it between Virginia's grave and the one beside it. Anna Rodriguez, "A mother's love is eternal." He sighed, brushing snow from the stone with his glove. "Hey, Mom, we're here." The third grave bore Robert's name, Paul Livingston, a life redeemed, a legacy of love. Laurie stood and reached for Tommy's hand, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold. "It doesn't feel real sometimes," she murmured, "that they're all gone." Tommy squeezed her hand, his gaze fixed on Robert's name. He'd tell us not to dwell on it, to keep going. They stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of memory settle around them. Laurie's thoughts drifted back to the years spent under Robert's care. He had been so much more than a guardian. He'd been a teacher, a guide, and eventually a father in every sense of the word. "Do you remember the pancake sundaes?" Laurie asked suddenly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. He always pretended he wasn't competitive, but he'd grumble every time we teased him about his uneven pancakes. Tommy chuckled, the sound breaking through the somber air. "Yeah, and he'd claim they were artisan style, like anyone believed that." They shared a laugh, the warmth of the memory pushing back the cold. "He was trying so hard," Laurie said, her voice softening, "and he never gave up on us." "That's why we can't give up either," Tommy replied, his tone resolute. "The foundation still has so much more to do. We owe it to him, and to Mom and Virginia, to keep it alive." Laurie nodded, her resolve matching her brother's. The Virginia-loving foundation had grown beyond anything they could have imagined, touching lives across the country. But there was always more work to be done. Plans for expansion into underserved rural areas were already underway, as were new programs for mental health support and educational scholarships. "We should start the mentorship program this spring," Laurie said, her mind turning to logistics. "It's what he always wanted, to prepare the next generation of leaders." Tommy smiled, his gaze shifting to the snow-dusted horizon, "and maybe a mobile clinic for the outlying communities. Something that reaches the people who can't come to us." Laurie's smile widened. He'd love that. As the snow fell harder, Laurie and Tommy placed their hands on Robert's headstone, a silent gesture of gratitude and promise. "We'll make you proud, Dad," Laurie whispered. "We'll keep the light alive." The siblings turned and began walking back down the path, the lantern casting long shadows across the snowy ground. The cemetery, once a place of sorrow, now felt like a sanctuary, a reminder of the lives that had shaped theirs and the love that endured through them. At the entrance, Laurie glanced back, her eyes lingering on the 3 graves beneath the oak tree. "They gave us everything," she said quietly. "And we'll keep giving it forward," Tommy replied, his voice firm. The snow continued to fall as they walked away, their footprints trailing behind them like echoes of the past. In their hearts, they carried not just the weight of loss, but the strength of the legacy left to them, a legacy of love, redemption, and the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could change the world. The lantern's glow bobbed gently as they disappeared into the distance, their path lit not just by its light, but by the unyielding spirit of those who had come before them. Together, they would continue the journey, ensuring that the names etched in stone would forever stand for hope. If this film touches your heart, leave your mark with a like, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to explore more meaningful stories with us. Share your feelings with us, and tell us your own stories. Every word you share is a building block that helps create our strong and enduring community. Together, we'll create a warm space where everyone can share and connect. Finally, don't miss the incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you the best selections, full of deep values yet entertaining. See you there.